may be the light at the end of this pandemic tunnel that has shut so much of us down for the past year or so. And we're having these discussions rooted around the vaccine that say there's going to be an end date where things are going to open up again because a sufficient amount of folks are going to be vaccinated. And there's talk of returning to the world, but it's not going to be the world that we knew. And I spend a lot of my focus thinking about the economic impact, what sort of capitalism we may be emerging to. But, in the spirit of holism, it's of course impossible to disconnect the economic realm from the social realm, from the psychological realm, from the spiritual realm. And I worry that not a lot of folks are thinking about what kind of world we are re-entering from a psychological, from a spiritual, from a mental health point of view. And I know that that's something that concerns you greatly.
I really do believe what we're all going through is a developmental trauma. It's a social trauma. And just a quick intentional tangent, David. Most people think that trauma is only car wreck, sexual assault, physical assault, war, such like that. Those are absolutely trauma. Those are what's called acute trauma that involves some kind of violation to the physical body. What is also in neuroscience, we use the word developmental or attachment trauma, which is trauma that does not physically violate or cut in any way hurt the body, but that does damage the nervous system, that does create ultimately patterns of either fight or flight or freeze responses from people. And so if we look at trauma that way, which is the most cutting edge, scientifically updated way to look at trauma, to think that I didn't ever get beaten as a child, so I don't have trauma, that's a way of thinking that isn't in alignment with the more modern science. So if we hold that lens, then absolutely what we're going through here is a social trauma or an attachment trauma, because what are we built for is we're built for connection and love. And what has been the main, not so subtle, but not exactly direct, printed on the stickers kind of messaging that we're getting this last year is gone are the days of love thy neighbor. Now it is fear thy neighbor. Gone are the days of human beings are all beautiful and interconnected and want to be in community and safety. Now it's look out for that random person walking by. They're probably an infectious disease petri dish. And that to me is not scientifically accurate, but it's what has been programmed into all of us now. And if we're not paying attention and if we're not conscious, we are going to live in that programming. And it breaks my heart when I see people move away from each other just from the sense you're human and I'm human. Do not underestimate what that's doing to your heart, to your spirituality, to your humanness, to your children. That's the part that breaks my heart the worst of all this, is watching what it's doing to our children.
We once knew what faces were and we once knew how to connect, but we paused it for a year. And like you're saying, we started to view people that we love as vectors of disease instead of potential sources of connection. You express gratitude, as I have, for the eye contact. But even that, I think, is not authentic. Right now, I'm looking you in the eye, but I'm not looking you in the eye, And so many of our Zoom facilitated meetings right now, there is research that suggests there is some positive impact of eye contact mediated by screens, but it's not the same as
Yeah.
eye contacted unmediated by screens. And one of the things I argue for in my forthcoming book is when we hear certain corporations say remote work is going to be the new normal because now they've seen how cost effective it is, I get very worried. Part of what makes teams effective in a work environment is real face-to-face eye contact, not Zoom mediated eye contact. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what's happening even there. Forget the masks, but even through the screens where I'm not really looking you in the eye right now, even though I'm superficially looking you in the eye right now.
It's such a great point. And prior to this question, I was even like, oh, do I look in the camera? Is that how I'm going to see his eye? No, I don't see him there. I have to look here. And it's so just to that point, it's not the same. And I also need to highlight the data I referenced is that it's not just eye contact. It is eye contact with love involved.
Mm.
Because as I listen to you speak, it also reminded me, actually, you're right. Like I'm grateful for the eye contact. And yet I admit at least 50% of humans that I make eye contact with these days, if I'm at the grocery store or whatever, it's this kind of eye contact where it's like, like we're looking, but we don't want to look too close, or we can't look too close. The leaking, the toxic leaking of the mask effect up into the eyes, even if they're visibly open and not masked, uh, that they're being impacted. And when you look someone in the eyes who's got fear in their eyes, it tends to mirror neuron back fear, or distance, right? So it's not as simple as just eye contact. And what do we do, and how do we move forward with any of this? That's the $1 million question. And you know I like what you just said. I think the first step, which is admittedly the easiest, is information, psychoeducation, helping people understand that, yeah, even if you think wearing the mask is the most important thing in the world right now, more all respect to you, just be aware what you are doing to yourself and to others in that context. And for me, as a scientist and a research minded person, at some point I start to look at, okay, but what are the overall real health risk of the COVID-19 virus versus what is the overall risk of longer and longer social trauma and developmental trauma? It's like asking that question: at what point do we weigh the scale to see how many things are being damaged? The economic, of course, is another big one. So to me, that's one of the dreams that I've had, David, of how do we make a shift right now? Is like, what if enough people wake up? What if enough people start to think, yeah, I definitely don't want to get COVID-19, but I also don't want to raise my child to be, socially damaged for the rest of his life, right?
It's fascinating. When I started reading about your world about 7 years ago, loosely talking about your world, the psychology world, one of the ideas that struck me, that seemed to at the time be a major theme in the psychology literature, is the idea that your trauma is your own, and there should be no shame in that, and you shouldn't feel that you have to compare that my trauma is lesser than someone else's trauma because of ABC. And I found that to be a very powerful and difficult idea, which has now been forgotten, because I think there'll be folks who will listen to what you just said and be horrified by it, because they'll say, well, wait a minute, what about the trauma of the old people you're killing? Right? That's where they jump right away. That, we can't find a balance, because ultimately you're talking about lives here. And there's this forgetting, there's this social, widespread, collective forgetting that the trauma your child feels is as important and real and valid as the trauma of an older person, as the trauma of a sick person, as the trauma of a dying person. And we've tried to reinstitute a hierarchy of trauma, right? Old people in nursing homes, most vulnerable, most worrisome, then racial issues, and and on and on. And we've tried to rank them. And I wonder where your field's landing. Has your field forgotten that older, perhaps more true idea of saying that, look, we don't have objective measures upon which we can safely rank trauma. And there has to be validity in a discussion that says, I'm a parent and I want to take more risks because I'm worried about the world that my child is growing up in. And that should be okay, even though we know someone who perhaps may not be a parent, or maybe a different type of parent, may not find that question interesting, right? Uh, how do we create space for these differing views when there's a polemical move to but death? you know I think that's the piece that's so interesting that you bring, that if we shift the language away from infection to trauma, we're going to have a very different conversation. If the conversation is only around infection and spread of infection, it's going to go one way. But if it's about trauma and types of trauma and levels of trauma and mitigating trauma, it's going to be a different conversation.
Well said. And the most academic definition of trauma is a disruption to the nervous system. In other words, from the neuroscience and the medical perspective, trauma is seen as any time that our nervous system goes away from its natural state, which is calm and open. And so, again, yes, if we hold that lens and we look at our through the trauma lens and say, wow, even though, yeah, the people are, maybe more people are staying alive because of all the safety precautions, lockdowns, masks, etc., but those who are staying alive are now living, many of them, if not all of us in some way, the nervous systems are now more pre-programmed to fear, flight, particularly. Some are fighting, with whatever story of reason as to why, but they're bringing their anger out. So, you're right, and though there's not, I don't believe there's really a way of saying this trauma is worse than others. And I have that, you're right, that does come up a lot in as a psychotherapist working with people. Is like, well, what right do I have to feel bad that my dad left when I was 5 because he didn't physically and sexually abuse me, so I should be fine? And that is a very self-defeating, destructive way of thinking, and it's not scientifically accurate. It'd be more accurate to say everyone has trauma, everyone has dysregulated their nervous system at some point. And while we can't, I don't believe, and I don't think it's fair to say, like you said, well, old people dying is a worse trauma than young people being brought up into a fear-based society. What I do have, and what the neuroscience what holds, is magnitude, frequency, and overall arc of trauma. And what we can measure is, well, how often is this person in a dysregulated state? How intense, how far from normal balance, homeostasis is it? And what the research has shown in that level is that repeated, what is often the word insidious is used, and I think there is an insidious nature to the fear and separation languaging and ideas that are being promoted right now. And so if we see insidious, repeated imbalance to the nervous system, such as a parent who never beats you, never even says, calls you bad, or yells at you, but is that controlling helicopter parent who tells you every second what you should be doing and continues to do that. By the time I'm 12, much less 20 or 30, guess what's downloaded in my brain? That's a developmental trauma. It's insidious. And that person goes through life in a more equally dysregulated space as the kid who had a one-time sexual assault from a babysitter when they were 5. And so that's what I know the research does show, is that acute and developmental traumas can be equally awful in magnitude and disruption. So to apply all that back to now, and your more direct question to COVID and this whole pandemic phenomenon, is that, if we were to do something very clinical and very much like sort of logic to measure this, we do have the technology now between EEGs and measuring the human electromagnetic field and such. There is technology where if we really cared, we could measure everyone and find out, well, what's the outcome if we let this sequence and perhaps we lose more elderly, but the world gets back to a healthier, open place? What's the collective overall magnitude of trauma versus if we stay in this and keep the insidious nature alive for however much longer. The longer we keep the insidious developmental trauma happening, the more it kind of spreads and hits a larger group of people and the magnitude grows. Whereas if a more acute trauma of death was to happen, boom, boom, boom. And I'm not here to say what's right or wrong. I'm just with you to say it's a very great way to reframe how right now we're only making the decisions, though the powers that be are only making the decisions based on the idea of death as the only real bad thing that could happen here. They're not really considering the developmental trauma that they're doing to the rest of all the surviving people.
Like your introduction of magnitude and frequency, those are variables that I look at a lot in my research on ethics. Like yourself, I don't try to say what's right or wrong, but I do and can rank the order of magnitude of ethical violations. Never gelled with the idea that I see in the psychology literature sometimes. I wouldn't say literature, but maybe in the more pop psychology world, that sort of cliche that says, love is the opposite of fear. I've never found that relationship, again, to be particularly interesting. But what I do think is interesting, and the language that you bring to this discussion that I'm grateful for, because it's not my natural direction, is if we bring in these variables of frequency and magnitude, it is undoubtedly true that in our society today, we are experiencing fear in a greater order of frequency and magnitude than love. And it's undoubtedly clear that that is problematic, right? And so
I just got tingles,
recognizing that,
David. I just
yeah,
got tingles when you said that, man. It means it's true.
yeah. How do we fix that? how do we address that problem? Is rather than look at it as a binary opposite, right? But if we just look at frequency and magnitude, what do we do as a next step?
Yeah, no, like I said, I got the truth tingles there. I think that you nailed it, and that's where my perspective has been as well. Is not that I wish death on anyone. I'm just looking at very much a utilitarianistic model, and so in the spirit of that, again, I think conversations like this are definitely a starting point. I think that even for me, when I go out in the world now, because I'm so conscious of what you just said, I'm right now going above and beyond my normal quota to really make loving eye contact with people, to try to strike up a little conversation, to really in my own way without wearing a t-shirt of it, but to just say like I'm still living in love. Like you know I get it, I'm gonna wear the mask, I'm gonna be distance, I'm gonna do all the safety precautions, and yet that doesn't have to stop me from loving you and seeing like, wow, you're still a beautiful human. Okay, we still have to kind of do these things that are ultimately fear driven. We do not have to be locked in the consciousness of fear while we do them. And, I think especially hoping someday once things do open again, I think that will be where we can really start the healing process of this. I don't know how much you can really train the nervous system to feel safe
Right,
and open
right,
when so much of your everyday surrounding is telling you fear, 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 fear for your life, fear for your life, fear your neighbor. It's definitely a, like I say, the magnitude and frequency is so strong right now. And that's something that we also know from, again, I'll stick to the lane I know, healing trauma. 100% is in the literature. The most recent work of sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR therapies, clinically proven approaches to treating trauma, that the experience of safety has to be there. That is the first thing that is needed. You do not go into any of the tough memories or content before that safety is there. And the powers that be are just doing a really great job of creating an environment that is the farthest thing from safe right now. So